again, that was a dance from Central Africa in the Gabon. Okay, next we have a speaker, very special speaker, Sherridan Schwartz, coming up to present for us. Please welcome Sherridan Schwartz, Dr. Sherridan Schwartz.
Good evening, everyone. The professor in me has to point out it's Schwartz with a Z, but so Schwartz with a Z at the end. Very excited to be here tonight, and basically just wanted to take some time to reflect on the African influence. And it's hard to talk about an entire continent's influence, but specifically the African influence on South America and the Caribbean, which is my area of policy and research. Afro-Brazilian policy in terms of colonization is what I decided to focus on for my graduate studies and in my research. And like a lot of academic research, it was fueled by pure curiosity, be it literal or intellectual, and self-interest. Because like a lot of African Americans, I didn't have a sense of where I was from. I knew where I was born. I'm from Houston, I'm a native Houstonian, but I never knew where I was from. Where are my people from? You know, and it's an endless quest of not just grandpa came from Louisiana, your mother came from Mississippi, but where were we from? And so I kind of wanted to explain how my interests sort of fueled an intellectual curiosity, and hopefully you go on this journey with me. I don't have a pointer, so I'm going to point, if it's okay, I'll point this way as we go along. Again, Schwartz with a Z. Branding so important these days. But so I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the historical context for the African influence on the Caribbean. And here on this slide, colonization and slavery, of course, go hand in hand. But we have to sort of reflect upon where did the Africans come from in Africa, since we use that term continentally, but specifically the West Africans. Because as you see, European slave traders, by and large, are pretty lazy people. So when the ships stopped, they grabbed who they could. And primarily we see this in Western coastal Africa. Here at the top, we're just talking about the fact that of the 90% of slaves who were taken from the African continent, 90% ended up in the Americas, specifically in the Caribbean and South America. And I think that's a fact that isn't really reflected upon, and it's a fact that isn't often taught. So when we talk about the slaves that came to what we call the New World, or at that time British North America, there were a very small fraction of the slaves that ended up in South America, and specifically, certainly Brazil, which was the first stop. If you look there, that purple line at the bottom, again, you're leaving, you're on a slave ship, you have your cargo, as our forefathers and ancestors and relatives were cargo. Brazil is your first stop, if you look at it that way. Keep in mind, I saw someone standing out with a sign that said, you know, go back to where you came from and take Obama with you. It's a very interesting context that we have in this country, but in the middle here, I wanted to point out that African slaves were the original settlers, certainly in terms of numbers, even in the New World here. So the majority of the African slaves brought here were in fact brought between 1720 and 1780. So the Africans on the North American continent precede, on average, statistically, European Americans by almost 100 years. Again, so, you know, as we talk about not just the indigenous Americans, but we as the original second wave of settlers, I think that's something that's not often told. And then specifically, I wanted to highlight Angola, because the Angolan region of West Central Africa made up literally more than half of all Africans sent to the Americas. So one country was literally decimated at the time. And the Angolans, for some reason, the hardiness, the ability to survive that middle passage meant that more Angolans ended up in the Caribbean and in South America than any one particular group. just an interesting point there. And again, Angola colonized by the Portuguese. And as we learn in the New World, it's all about who colonized you. That has every single influence on whether or not you're Senegalese and speak French, whether or not you're Angolan and speak Portuguese, whether or not you're from Cape Verde. It has Cote d'Ivoire. It has everything to do with who colonized you. And here, obviously Brazil is my area of specific study, but I just wanted to point out, as we saw the map, to see from Africa to Brazil, specifically West Africa, get an idea of the scale. Because here you have ships landing in a place that, no matter how the slaves viewed not being at home, in a way seemed very familiar. So Brazil's temperate climate, very much tropical and subtropical climate, and temperate in the north, very much mimics coastal in Western Africa in so many ways. The terrain is very similar. So, but size-wise alone, again, you have a country that had a small group of indigenous people and then all of a sudden get the influx. And on our next slide, we're going to see again with that migration, Brazil was the first stop. The majority of slaves who left Africa landed in Brazil. And what I like to focus on is how that changed a country. Despite what they teach us on TV, most Brazilians do not look like Giselle Bündchen. They are not blonde, they are not blue-eyed. And if you go to the country, you see the influence of this strong, especially West African influence, that we're going to talk about some more. I never do a talk on Africa without including the picture of the famous Door of No Return in Elmira. The American Castle Door of No Return in Ghana is always really important to me, because not just visiting it by itself is moving, but for a lot of slaves, this was the last thing they saw. So no matter where you would take it in that part of West Africa, that door, and it's a very small door, was the last thing that many of them saw before they went to the New World. And the reason why I think the door is so important is that you have to imagine whatever they took with them had to go with them through that door. So the fact that so much culture survived, I think, is really important. Again, this was a 15th century fort built by the Portuguese to fight off the indigenous people that were there, and then ended up being used as the largest slave trading port in Africa. Here, of course, we have to talk about not just what slavery was about, but slavery and sugar are synonymous, because there's a reason why the Europeans ended up going to trade and going to explore. They were looking for spices, and specifically sugar. Sugar is something that has to grow in the most humid, hot, tropical climate. You cannot grow sugar in Europe. But the Europeans had such a quest and a thirst for it. It was the most valuable commodity and crop. And here we're just talking about the places all over the Caribbean and all over the South American continent where sugar can be grown, where it can be processed, and where it can yield the maximum crop. Wherever you see sugar, I teach my students, you see slavery. You don't see free people willingly growing sugar until well into the 20th century. So when people talk about 12 years a slave and cotton, picking cotton was hard, back-breaking labor. But growing and cultivating sugar was deathly. There are no indentured servitude, there's no history or tradition of that in sugar, because even poor free whites would not pick sugar. It was back-breaking caning, and then it had to be cropped, it had to be boiled down, and the boiling houses would have temperatures of over 140 degrees. So the quest to continue to pull West African slaves was fueled by sugar. Because if you survived the Middle Passage, survived being sold into slavery, and ended up in one of these places, keep in mind, this is where 90% of the slaves taken from the continent went. If you survived that and went to work in a sugar crop or a sugar plantation or a boiling house, your mortality rate was significantly lower than if you were in the fields picking traditional crops. So I always want to make sure we talk about sugar. And then we see, of course, Jamaica, Brazil, Dominican Republic, West Indies, Trinidad, St. Croix, Barbados, Antigua, St. Kitts, Nevis. These are places that they could bring West African slaves and they could thrive in the heat, thrive in the humidity, and survive. So that was the single most important crop. Thank you. What we did see is that any place you see South American and Caribbean African influence, you primarily generally see the West African influences. As I said, my own interest in this area was fueled by a self-interest. My first trips to Africa were to East Africa, but upon visiting West Africa, I looked at my original travels to Brazil starting back in the late 90s with a completely different eye. Because now I can see, once visiting Africa myself, West Africa specifically, the influences that I saw in Brazil but couldn't identify, that I saw in Argentina even and couldn't identify, and particularly all over the Caribbean. I also wanted to note that Carlos Santana has been known to study a lot of West African religion, and I just kind of centered on one of his songs, Hannibal, there, because Hannibal has a lot of original, very strong Yoruba Orisha words and a chant to the god Shango, the Orisha Shango. So if you've ever heard that, it's on the Z-Bop album. But it just shows you how strong that influence is. He got interested in that after visiting Brazil, ironically, went back, and that's how he got interested enough to make that song. Next slide. We can't talk about the West African influence on the Caribbean without talking about, again, not just the Yoruba, but the Igbo influence. One of the things that separates the South American and Caribbean African experience was that you saw a little bit of an opportunity for those slaves to preserve a little bit more of their culture. How important is that? Well, in this country, we know what happened. We've all seen Roots, we've seen these things, we've seen Shaka Zulu. There was a sublimation that was really important to the colonizers here that was not as important to other people. The Portuguese, for example, let this number, because it was multitudes of West African slaves, keep their food, keep their language, keep their culture, keep their history, keep their oral traditions. That's why when you go to Brazil today, you see people eating foods that are traditionally African. You hear music that is African. You listen to samba. You do capoeira. You see the influence that thrived over this time. The Igbo people also shared with the Yorubas in that not only were there more of them, but they were involved, particularly in Barbados, in some of the major rebellions in Barbados, and also as well in Jamaica. So the Igbo groups who came, the West African Igbos, because at that point, the countries weren't as split in those colonized ways that we talk about. So I talk more on the actual groups of people and not the countries. But let's say, in this case, Nigeria, we would call it present-day Nigeria, also Benin and parts of Ghana as well. They were involved in some of the earliest rebellions. So these slaves, fueled by their sheer numbers and their sheer desire for freedom and to preserve their culture, the independence of these nations. The rebellion of the Igbo slaves in Barbados helped Barbados become independent. The rebellion of the Igbo people in Jamaica helped these rebellions fuel, again, the independence of Jamaica. So when we talk about the number of slaves, we have to look at the fact that the sheer numbers there also gave them an opportunity to fuel independence. Again, Yoruba in the New World, we're talking about the influence of the Orisha. In Brazil, for example, everyone there can tell you when they were born, who their patron saint is, what their astrological sign is, and what their Orisha is. That's just like asking your name. We don't have that sense here. But in Brazil, it's so common, be you a Brazilian European, Brazilian of Portuguese descent, although it's a melting pot of a country, everyone, again, has this sense of this Yoruba culture. It is permeated in every single aspect, from working class to the upper class. Who your Orisha is very important. I narrowed down on this one because I didn't know who my Orisha was, but when they found out I was a Pisces, they said, oh, you're probably Yamaya, if that's when you were born. Yamaya is the ocean. She's the goddess of oceans and motherhood. So, and again, the word Santeria here has been demonized, but it's just a traditional faith. As with lots of faiths over the hundreds of years, it's taken on a different meaning and different interpretation. But Santeria was originally just a traditional faith, as of which we have many, many across the world. But so I picked the Yamaya, and in Brazil, every single New Year's Eve, they set out these elaborate altars to this Orisha. And every single Brazilian who is able to financially, physically goes and prays to this Orisha for a fruitful, fertile, and a prosperous year. They do it the same way we drop the ball on New Year's Eve. It's that clear how much this West African culture has permeated Brazil. Next slide. On my last trip to Brazil, I was amazed at, again, I got the opportunity in this most recent trip to get a little bit out of the cities and go into northeastern Brazil. Northeastern Brazil is where we would traditionally say there are more Afro-Brazilians. I try not to use the term Afro-Brazilian because I believe it's redundant. There are more people in Brazil of African descent than there are people who are not of African descent, but we go with the term Afro-Brazilian. And in this trip, I was so struck by how in this little part of this rural area of Brazil, everybody looked like me. They looked like my cousins. They looked like my uncles. They looked like my family. And I said, that's it, I've had it. I know that this culture, this Brazilian culture that I've adopted so much, I see the influence of Africa, but I want to know where I fit in. So after I got back on this trip, I rode off to have my African ancestry done. Sure enough, I came back with 100% matrilineal match only, because I'm a woman, 2 X's. So I came back with a 100% Yoruba and Fulani match. So I personally carry the DNA that not just of the Yoruba and Fulani people of Nigeria, but that over 90% of Brazilians carry. That's why it seems so familiar to me. That's why I've adopted their culture. Those are my people. So this is an almost 5,000-year match to where my maternal ancestors were 5,000 years ago, and where you find the most people now that have my DNA. It was a life-changing experience, but it reaffirmed what I always knew. As when I brought this outfit in Ghana 3 years ago, I didn't know what I was. So again, I'm adopting a culture that's not mine. I bought the Ashanti fabric because they were proud warriors of Ghana. I had it made in a Yoruba style because they were the people that I'm most identified with. And I had it done in a way that Brazilians traditionally dress. So that was a personal note there, just to say that it's not just academic, it's personal. There were more of us, of Africans, those of African descent, taken to this continent. Brazil is just one country that let that culture thrive. The national food of Brazil is an African dish. It is a stew, feijoada, made of black beans. It's made of greens. It's made of pounded root. It's made of oil, and it's usually done with a palm or peanut oil. And it's something that would be familiar to just about any single West African anywhere in any part of that continent. Next slide. That's the actual DNA breakdown, which tells you exactly, I paid to have it sequenced to tell you exactly where and how far back. So this is a 2,000-year match. And this would probably, again, match about 88 to 90% of the people of African descent in Brazil. Next slide. And I'm just going to finish with, I'm telling my story, but my story is such a familiar story. It fueled my desire to find out more about a group of people. And as my colleague said before, when I told people I wanted to study African, sub-Saharan African and Brazilian policy, people would go, oh, those poor people. Africa's not poor, ladies and gentlemen. It is the richest continent in both natural resources, minerals, and every single thing that we value. But Africa's been the world's ATM They started by taking our people, which as any human resources person can tell you, is the organization's most valuable resource. They took our people, and now they came back with the natural resources. Some of us are just trying to get it back. Thank you.